Welcome, engineers. Welcome to another CCNA at lunch. I guess it's certifications at lunch, but this week it's CCNA at lunch all week. In honor of Cisco Live last week, we did a bunch of Cisco Live conference talks and some discussions about how to best, let's say, attend conferences, for example. This week we're going to continue with the Cisco theme and do CCNA content. I talked at the end of last week about how the CCNA had changed. Let's talk about how we would study for a CCNA then. What I would do, where I would start, where I would go. That's what we'll do as we progress through the week. I was going to start today with some study tips, and specifically I would start with on our rundown here. So my study tips, I would say, know how you study best. In terms of just the tips, I'm going to talk about what I think are kind of the best places to start. But in terms of study methodology, I always tell people I'm a break stuff type of person. So I like to lab them out, and you will see a lot of people, let's say on IT and InfoSec Twitter, and you'll see me as well on IT and InfoSec Twitter say the exact same things, which is lab these things out, break stuff, mess around, connect things, and break things. That's the way that things stick for me. It's also the way that things stick for you if you think about it in general, like when you do your job, even if you're not in IT for now, right, or in cybersecurity or whatever it may be, right? If the things that you do on an everyday basis, the things that you repeat are the stuff that you remember and what you know how to do. So what I would do, and that brings me to that end point here on the rundown, which is I'll kind of show Packet Tracer and a little bit of info about it because I talked about Packet Tracer last week. So what I would do is lab things. That's how I do it. There are other study methodologies, and I know like flashcards. I know that Keith Barker does some CCNA quizzes on every Sunday. Check Keith out. He's amazing. I know that there's a bunch of great written content out there. Todd Lamley, who's a friend of the show or a friend of mine, also makes some great written content. Check out his stuff. But that being said, so those are kind of my quick hits on study tips as we're already 2 or 3 minutes in here. Wow. Let's talk about fundamentals. So I would always start with the fundamentals. I talk about myself as a PhD in engineering. I'm a fundamentals guy, and in engineering specifically, and like PhD studies, it's always building up from the fundamentals. And I think if you have a great fundamental base, that gives you a great methodology for troubleshooting. And we talk about troubleshooting in terms of like the real world, but even on an exam, when you start eliminating questions, using your knowledge, don't just like think and look at let's say a CCNA question and go, do I know this or don't I? And then panic. That's not how these things work. That's not how I take tests either. When I look at these things, I go, what can I eliminate? What do I know? If I know the answer, obviously I'll pick the one out. But even, these things happen where you look at an answer set and you go, I know the answer to this and it's not here. Why isn't it here? Now I have to go back through and wait through the questions. Okay, so how do the fundamentals help you with this? What I mean by the fundamentals is things like addressing systems, things like binary, hexadecimal, base 10 addressing systems, and the numbering systems. And you would say, well, Travis, I need those for things like MAC addressing and IP addressing and yada yada. Yeah, I agree with you, right? But subnetting, for example, is going to be a lot harder if you don't have the fundamentals of like bit structures, binary and hexadecimal and binary to hexadecimal conversion and things like this. And so for some of us who are a little bit more like involved in the tech space, these are a little bit more natural. For some of you who aren't as familiar with binary and base 10 and hexadecimal conversion, that's something you should start with, right? Because when you go to subnetting, you're like, ooh, I probably should have the fundamentals a little bit more down pat. And I always say, if you have an issue with a subnetting question, for example, and I'll do some subnetting later in the week, we'll talk about it in the middle of the day here. But when you go to do one of those, and if you forget, let's say you blank on, block sizing or something like this, if you understand the fundamentals, you should be able to go back through and do it if you had to. Now that hurts your time and things like that on an exam, but in the real world, you're like, I'll figure it out, right? So some fundamentals, also things like the OSI model, Open Systems Interconnect, so kind of how the data gets examined in the stack. These are some really fundamental components that you can start with, right? What does the stack look like? What does hexadecimal, binary, and decimal conversions? We'll talk about physical and virtual fundamentals here in just a second. And then the last one is the engineering and troubleshooting mindset. You should always be in that mindset, and a lot of people are not. It's the hardest thing to do, and one of the most important components of especially IT and cybersecurity and all of these, let's say, digital space jobs, right, is understanding how to troubleshoot things because you're not physically in front of it. You're not a plumber and going, where's the leak, right, which is a little bit easier to see. Where is my data leak? Well, now I need to know the fundamentals, and I have to have that engineering troubleshooting mindset to fix these things. And that's the same thing in an exam. So in a CCNA exam, you see something you don't know, the first instinct to do is, I don't know what to do, right? But the first instinct of an engineer is, all right, what do I know? That's the first instinct of me, right? Is what do I know? What do I know about this thing, and how can I eliminate some of the problems that I'm having? I go through that systematically in everything that I do these days, and it's just a function of how I operate because of my background in engineering, and I think that would serve you really well to get that mindset ingrained in your head. Try and break things, even if it's just setting up a packet tracer instance and dragging some switches in and connecting switches up and not knowing why they're not connecting. Learn by doing too. You can go back to the YouTube content from myself or Keith Barker or Network Chuck or who your favorite network content provider is. But at the end of the day, you've got to fix that thing, and you probably want to sit and bang your head against the keyboard for a little while to try and let it sink in. Physically banging your head against the keyboard, maybe not the biggest deal in the world. You don't have to do that, I guess, but anyway. Okay, so physical and virtual fundamentals. So physical fundamentals, the fundamentals of cabling, connectors, hardware, switches, routers, wireless access points, these types of things, antennas. I know that you're like, that's more of like, let's say a CompTIA's Network Plus type of thing, but when you see the words, right, when you see that nomenclature in the test questions, and in your real life, it's going to give you a great ground and a foot to stand on when you think about what's going on, right? RJ45, DB9, DB11, crossover and straight through cabling. You're like, okay, yeah, maybe there's a question or two, and CCNA has been updated to not necessarily pound those fundamentals of like hardware, but when you know those things, it makes it easier for you to visualize the question, understand the data traversal, understand what might be happening, why an interface might be flapping, these types of things. And then also the virtual fundamentals, right? So fundamentals of things like IP addressing, MAC addressing. Although you think of MAC addressing as like a physical burned-in address, it can be manipulated, and it really is bits on the wire, right? So these types of things, the virtual components, host names, all those components that are defined in software, that are defined in the CLI, the command line interface. And then that being said, getting to the command line interface, right? With 2.5 minutes here, we're gonna get the timer out of the way and just do 2 minutes in Packet Tracer. So if I pull up Packet Tracer, and I've got my little router or pull in a switch here, and I get in this virtual environment, right? This is the virtual environment you would probably want to be working in your lab infrastructures. Remember, I talked on Friday, I think, if you're here, about how I think Packet Tracer is a great infrastructure, especially for the fundamentals, which is what the CCNA is testing. And so if I wanted to change, let's say, a fundamental virtual definition in this router, right? Like the host name, and I would name it Travis IQ. Oops. I need to be in the configuration mode. And I want to name it host name Travis IQ. Right? That's a specific fundamental definition that we have just changed. We are in the CLI. We are using Packet Tracer. This is free from Cisco. Utilize it extensively until you, let's say, outgrow it and need some additional functionality with something like CML or GNS3, right? And so that being said, we've talked just a little bit in 10 minutes about how I would start prepping for a CCNA, where I would start from the baselines and why I think that's important, and what I would use for my baseline beginning here, which is something like Packet Tracer. We are right up against the time, as is always the case. I will continue with my CCNA discussions tomorrow and the following day, but as is always the case, engineer, break stuff, have fun. We'll see you tomorrow.